Okay, this is the second of two lectures on discourse analysis, and in this session I'm going to be focusing on Foucauldian discourse analysis. That is the form of discourse analysis that was developed by Michel Foucault. To start with a quotation from Stuart Hall, who wrote about Foucault. Hall says, for Foucault, a discourse is a group of statements which provides a language for talking about, or a way of representing the knowledge about, a particular topic at a particular historical moment. Discourse is about the production of knowledge through language. But since all social practices entail meaning, and meanings shape and influence what we do, our conduct, all practices, have a discursive aspect. So what you get from this is the idea, first of all, that discourses are everywhere and everything. That it's through discourses that we give the world meaning, and it's through that we come to understand the world, and our social practices are the use of those discourses, those meanings, to understand the world. They shape and influence it, but they constitute it as well. And they're ways of representing knowledge, and I'll have more to say about that later on, at a particular historical moment, so that at any particular time, the discourses we're using may be different from those experienced at another historical moment. So you can see that the notion of discourse is pretty central here to Foucault's approach. Essentially, he's saying all social practices should be understood by discursive construction, by the use of constructs in discourse. We actually construct the event itself. We actually give rise to it, and we do it, so to speak. Our discourse then allows and limits the possibilities of understanding the objects that it refers to, the objects that it creates in that sense. And it both allows, and that's an important point, and it limits those possibilities. So it's essentially saying what can be said, by whom, where and when, or what has meaning and what can be said by whom, where and when. For example, just give an example of a development of a particular historical construct. Let me look at the notion of the homosexual man. This was a concept that developed only in the late 19th century. Of course, there had been homosexual actions, behaviour and so on, and people who had such interests well before then. There's always been such behaviour in human society. But the concept of the homosexual itself was something that came into existence at a particular historical period and remained with us for some almost 200 years. So it brings with it a particular understanding, a constructing of the subject. In this case, the subject is the homosexual person. And it does that via a range of medical, moral and legal discourses. In Foucault's sense, then, that notion of the homosexual has defined the subject itself, and we as people can only then occupy certain positions in society dictated by those subjects. People are therefore positioned as, in this case, homosexual, and having been positioned in that way, were then seen as sick, illegal, worthy of punishment, and so on, depending what aspects of the medical, moral and legal discourses you're referring to. Now, this is a very strong way in which discourses defines, in this case, the homosexual person, and it allows and limits what can be done and what can be said and how people can behave, that is, how they can occupy those positions. Of course, that is changing now, and that concept, that 19th century concept of homosexual, is something that's now rapidly changing, particularly in British society. So there no longer are homosexuals seen in the same way as needing, moral control or some kind of punishment and so on. This extends to, in Foucault's sense, into the notion of the subjective self as well. It is not just that we accept the practices, the discourses and all the ideas that go with them, which we are presented with as we come into contact with society. But as I said, we position ourselves within those. We come to understand ourselves in that kind of way, using that conceptual map. So in one sense, we take on the roles defined by those concepts. We think of ourselves in those kinds of terms. We describe ourselves that way, and we act in the ways that are expected of those subject positions. So we adopt those subject positions. It creates our subjectivity, our sense of ourselves, our own identity to do that. So it's a very strong sense for Foucault in which these discourses are actually creating the very subjective experience of ourselves. Another example of this can be taken from the work by Edley. Edley's a British discourse analyst, and some years ago now he interviewed a range of 17 to 18-year-olds about the notion of the subject positions of masculinity. What kinds of discourses about masculinity could they use, would they use? And by analysing a number of those interviews, he discovered that there were three major subject positions which they were bringing forward, subject positions about being masculine or identifying masculinity. The first of those may be familiar to you from the films and so on. It's what Edley refers to as the Hollywood hero subject position. It's the James Bond, the Rocky, the Rambo type person. The individual, the male who is seeking out and enjoying the challenge of risky situations, having courage in facing one's enemies and acting in a cool manner. So that was one way in which these young men portrayed themselves and identified these subject positions which they could occupy. But not all of them did that. Some had different positions. Another very common one was what Edley refers to as the Mr. Average or the middle of the road subject position. Here, the respondents claimed that they were different from the Hollywood type media messages. They weren't like that at all. They rejected that kind of hero subject position and constructed themselves as, in some sense, the negative of it, the opposite of that. I'm not at all like that, they would say, without necessarily specifying exactly what it was they were like, but they rejected that position of the Hollywood movie model, if you like, a Hollywood media image. And then there was a third position, a third form of subject position about masculinity that some of the men adopted. This also was a contrast with the macho man image, and it's what Edley refers to as the multi-faceted personality. In this case, the young men described themselves as being comfortable with doing things that were more conventionally seen as associated with women, such as expression emotions and so on. So these kinds of things were seen as perhaps normally associated with non-masculinity, but for them it was part of being masculine that those things were acceptable and to be done. So again, you could say a rejection of the macho image, but another way of formulating that image in a much more positive sense than the second subject position. So that's Edley then, three subject positions which his analysis of discourse enabled him to describe and identify. Now, to go back to Foucault's approach to discourse, an absolutely central part of his approach is that these discourses are tied up with power and authority in society. Knowledge, he said, is put to work via discursive practices to regulate people's conduct. So the adoption or the adaptation of subject positions, the taking on of those discourses by people, is a way in which they are controlled and regulated. For example, discursive constructions of sexuality in medical terms result in medical control, and the same thing in legal terms, in legal control. So the very notion of sexuality is something which, in a sense, describes these things and also at the same time enables some kind of control and authority over people, in this case by medical practices. And for Foucault, there's a combination here of both the kind of the power that comes with that and the knowledge that's bound up in it. So the medical knowledge about sexuality itself comes with those powers. That discourse of the medical notions of sexuality brings with it all kinds of ways in which people's conduct and behaviour can be regulated, controlled, and so on. And it limits social practices as well to certain kinds of things. Only certain sorts of things are available for us to do. Now in this, Foucault is rejecting a central idea that's been around for many hundreds of years in European thought about the notion of power, which is that power in some sense is the way that you constrain others. The notion of power as being something that you can do to control other people, to make them do things they wouldn't normally want to do or they might not think of doing. That kind of notion that power is control, it's preventing, it's repressing, it's censoring, concealing and so on. Now, in rejecting that, Foucault is not saying he wants to reject all those ideas, but rather he wants to say that in addition to those ideas, the notion of discursive power also produces reality. It does positive things too. So the whole realm of psychiatric knowledge, of medical knowledge, of notions of sexuality and so on, all of these things develop, in scientific ways and in other kinds of fashion to develop our knowledge. And they produce ways that restrict our behaviour, but also they enable our behaviour. They produce new objects, new domains, new rituals of truth, as he puts it, through which we can do things. So the notion of power here is both enabling and constraining at the same time. Now, one particular way in which that constraint or that enabling happens is through what Foucault refers to as dominant discourses. There are certain discursive complexes, if you like, certain subject positions that go with that, which tend to be privileged. And they privileged versions of social reality and the existing power relations that lie behind them and so on. In fact, some of these discourses are so entrenched that it's difficult to see how they could be challenged. They become, if you like, common sense views of the world. And this is what he refers to as dominant discourses. They're so obvious, they're so taken for granted that we can't see any other way of doing things. But, he wants to argue, alternatives are always possible. There is a sense of history here that things have changed. They haven't always been that way, in the way determined by these discourses. They're not eternal. They do come and go. And so they have a history, or as he puts it, a genealogy, a way in which they can change over time, or maybe even disappear over time, or appear and then disappear over time. So alternatives are possible, even though, at any one particular period, the discourses tend to dominate and determine the kinds of ways we can think and behave and so on. Now, those dominant discourses are also connected with another important aspect of Foucault's approach, which is the institutions in which they're embedded. It's not just that they exist in some kind of ephemeral way in the language you use and so on, but rather they're embedded in actual institutions and the various kinds of behaviours and the various kinds of individuals and regulations that go along with those institutions. So discourses are not just ways of speaking and writing, they're bound up with institutional practices, ways of organising, regulating and administering social life that come with perhaps the medical profession, perhaps the scientific profession, perhaps the legal profession, that come with politics, that come with the media and so on, all these different areas and institutions of our experience. So, for example, let's take the medical one again, being positioned as a patient in a medical discourse means that one's body becomes an object of legitimate interest to doctors and nurses, and may be exposed, touched, invaded in the process of treatment as part of the practice of medicine. Now, we don't see this as threatening necessarily because we are part of the discourse. We're part of this institutional practice that medicine has, whereby it's doing us good in the main, by its various ways in which it exposes us and invades us and opens us up and puts drugs inside us and operates on us and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, for Foucault, this is an institutional practice with a set of discourses and a set of subject positions that go with that. Subject positions as doctor or nurse or patient or victim or whatever. Okay, let me turn my attention now then to how you might actually undertake a discursive analysis following Foucault's approach. How might you bring in these ideas I've been mentioning of the discourse, the subject positions, the dominant discourses and the institutional practices? Well, the important things to bear in mind here are, in contrast with perhaps discursive psychology, the focus here is very much on discourses and explicitly on the power and the politics behind those discourses. In fact, usually theorists take a specific stance towards those as a way of undermining what they see as oppressive discourses, oppressive practices. So it's often a critical kind of approach that's taken in Foucauldian discourse analysis. Secondly, almost anything is a discourse. As I've said, discourse is everywhere. It defines the meaning of life for us. And what's more, for Foucauldian approaches, the discourse doesn't have to be just words. It can be anything that has meaning or can give things meaning. So it includes a whole range of visual things, pictures and video and so on, that can be included, as well as other kinds of visual phenomena, like icons or adverts and so on and so forth that we might come across. All of these things embed discourses, create discourses, and in that way come to structure our experience of the world. And as you might tell from that, the focus of Foucauldian discourse analysis is very much more at a macro level kind of analysis, rather than the minute analysis of how individual words and phrases are used and how the turn taking in talk happens that is associated with discursive psychology. In contrast, Foucauldian approaches tend to look at the macro level of discourse. They look at large-scale objects, which might be, public speeches or published books or whole TV programs and so on, quite large-scale things. Now, various people have tried to identify stages of analysis here. Different authors have come up with different numbers, some 4 or 5 or 6. The most probably is from Ian Parker, who's been very keen on Foucauldian approaches, who comes up with 20 stages. I'm not going to go through all those now. If you want to, follow up Ian Parker's work. But essentially, most of those 20 stages can be captured by the following points, by the following focuses. First of all, the focus on subjects and objects. The first stage then, by reading text or by listening to things, by watching things, by looking at images and so on, is to identify the discursive resources. What kind of to use the discursive psychology term, what kind of interpretive repertoires are being used here? What kinds of topics and themes come up? As I said just now, the important thing here is to keep it at a macro level, not to get too minute into the grammar, but to think overall of a larger scale discourses that are being used. And to do that, you must use your own cultural knowledge. After all, you live in this culture, you partake of it, and you share in it. So you have some understanding of what's going on. So you must use that as a way of identifying what is going on in these discourses that you come across. And you can also look for indirect references, not just explicit things, but indirect things too, things that are not quite said or just hinted at in various ways, or even maybe things that aren't said at all, things that are missed out, but which you might expect to hear about in a discourse. So there's a whole range of ways in which you can look at these resources, the terms, the words, the meanings being used and so on to begin with. So identifying them is the first thing. Then you can look at the relationship between the discourses. There are many contrasting discourses about objects and events in the world. And as I've already indicated with some examples, like the one from Edley, there can be contrasting different discourses on the same topic. In that case, it was masculinity. So objects may be constructed in contradictory ways. And even the same person using constructs may use contradictory constructs. And certainly across different kinds of groups of people and different institutions, you may well find different kinds of contradictory discourses. And as I said before, discourses are also historically and culturally situated. So again, you may find different historical periods, different cultures, throwing out different discourses, demonstrating different discourses. And so once we've got that, we can then ask how they arose. How do they come into being? Who was it and what institutions were associated with their growth in importance and dominance? So the second stage then is this looking at the relationship between discourses, the appreciation there may be multiple discourses and that they may come and go and they may in fact disagree with each other. Thirdly, there's an action orientation here in Foucault's work. we have to look particularly at how those constructions are being used. Once we identify the discourses and the range of them, how are they being used? What are they doing? Who gains or loses from that particular subject position that's being identified in that discourse? Which particular institutions are associated with that discourse? And we need to see how people use them in their normal speech and in other kinds of contexts, perhaps in politics or in the law or whatever, to do things like attribute responsibility, to highlight one's own contribution or to disclaim responsibility and so on. In various kinds of ways people are using these discourses to achieve things, to act in the world. And so this is the action orientation of discourses that needs to be looked at. Now, I've already mentioned positioning, subject positioning, as a key part of Foucault's approach here. Of course, we can look for those too in the discourses we're examining. So what kinds of subject positions does the discourse offer us? What kinds of different people, individuals, does it talk about? And therefore, can we be, or can others be? So how does it categorise people? How does it create different types of people, these discourses? Or what different kinds of activities that are on offer that people could adopt for themselves or assign to others and so on? And of course, what kind of actions that follow on from that are made possible or possibly are prohibited by those discourses, or at least looked down upon or disapproved of by those discourses. So look at the range of positions then that are thrown up by discourses is the next stage. As I mentioned earlier on, discourses for Foucault are inevitably tied up with power. So in this case, I think it's a reasonable question to ask about the discourses to see how they are supporting institutions and reproducing power relationships. Which institutions, which views do they have, are supported by these discourses, by these ways of talking, ways of identifying individuals. And we can look at the gains and losses that come from their use. What kinds of political or moral stances are supported or attacked or undermined by these discourses. For Foucauldians, remember, it's not impossible, or rather it's impossible not to be political in this. You have to take a stance, you have to take a view that says these particular discourses are doing a certain kind of thing here, which we have to challenge and perhaps even identify. Now, as well as these overarching ideas in Foucauldian discourse, there are particular things you can look for or ask about, and I thought I'd just rehearse some of those now as well. A kind of a checklist of things to look for. I've already mentioned this, but I'll say it again, hidden relations of power in the text. So what kinds of power relationships lie behind the text that the discourses are identifying? Who is exercising the power? That is, the discourse is being presented. Who is gaining from them? Who is using them to support their position and their power in society? To put it another way, who is the ideal subject or audience for the text? Who are they aimed at? Who is meant to be listening to this and who is meant to be responding to it? Again, as I said before, don't forget to look at what is unspecified or unsaid. The things that are left out are sometimes important as well. Maybe groups of people or different ways of seeing the world are simply not mentioned by the discourse. So that might be interesting in itself. In a more detailed fashion, we look at things like the passive voice, the reification of things, the identification of things as things themselves rather than as people. And of course, the other side of that coin is to look at the colourful descriptive language, the adjectives, the metaphors and so on, that indicates a strong discourse and maybe strong views and perhaps the use of quite strong powers behind those discourses. We can also ask whether there could be alternative wording. How else might it be said? How could that information have been conveyed using other kinds of terms, other kinds of discourses? A different kind of privileging of discourse, perhaps. And of course, more generally, how are events presented? Things that have happened. can be presented in a variety of ways, and one of those may be what's being done before us in the discourse. And with that, we can look at how the people themselves are characterised. The individuals involved in those events can be seen as certain kinds of individuals who have certain kinds of subject positions, and with that, certain kinds of behaviours that they're allowed to do. And of course, even more explicitly, we can look at the message that the author intends you to get from the text. What are they trying to say to you? We can also ask of images, and or the visual things we're looking at, or if it's a text with images, the images in the text, and ask why were they chosen? Why were those particular things the things to do? A bit like we ask the same thing of the words, we can ask the same thing of the images as well. We can also look at repetition within the text, repetition across different discourses and different texts on the same topic. Repetition might be an indication of some kind of dominance of that discourse, or it might be some kind of suggestion of hesitancy about its use, that people feel they have to repeat it again because it's not exactly agreed upon. And of course we can look at the media themselves who are producing these discourses very often. What kinds of professional media practices assist with the presentation of such dominant discourses? You know, the editorial constraints, the journalistic standards, and so on and so forth. Let me finish this by looking at a few criticisms of discourse analysis, partly of Foucauldian, but also partly of discursive psychology as well. The first common criticism made here is that the simple separation between these two kinds of discourse, the discursive psychology and the Foucauldian discourse analysis. And they have been caused by a variety of writers, for example Margaret Wetherell, to unite the two together, to use what Wetherell calls an eclectic approach to discourse analysis. And I think that's probably becoming much more common now. Discourse has spread outside the social sciences, being used in humanities a lot, media studies and so on. And that has led to a much more general approach to discourse analysis that unites together these various aspects of discourse analysis. A second criticism often made of discourse analysis is that it doesn't seem to be at all concerned with authorial intention. In other words, what did the people intend by what they said, by the discourses they used? It's concerned with rhetorical force, but not the intention of people. What people did and not what they intended. But nevertheless, it still uses an implicit model of the person as an active discourse user. So in some sense, at one level, the discourse leaves out the person and their intent. But in order to be a discourse user at all, you have to have certain intents to have some kind of effect through the discourses you're using. So there's a kind of contradiction behind discourse analysis here between the relative unimportance for some discourse analysts of any kind of intention, and yet the fact that the whole notion of discourse rests upon this idea that we are trying to use language to achieve certain kinds of effects in certain kinds of ways. So we are using it intentionally. A third area of criticism is centres around what you might call discursive determinism. The idea, and I think this comes very strongly from a Foucauldian perspective particularly, but it's also true of psychological discourse as well, discursive psychology rather, which is that we are given almost no choice of how to use these discourses, what discourses we have. Once we're assigned a subject position within a discourse, it looks like we have no choice of escaping it. There's no way out. And yet, as I've said, discourses do have histories, in Foucault's terms, a genealogy. They do change, they do arise, and they do die away. So that leaves us with the question, if they're so dominant, they're so deterministic as to how we can act and behave and what subject positions we might adopt, then how can they ever change? How can they ever be left aside, or how can we ever have competing discourses? It seems there's a need to some kind of reference to something outside the discourse. We need to refer to something else in our experience, in society perhaps, or in ourselves, that explains why we do things differently. And various writers have done this by referring to psychoanalysis, for example, at individual levels, or personal history, or the material world, as areas that would explain why things are not always completely determined by discourses. Now this actually to some extent overlaps with the last criticism, which is the relativism versus realism debate. And for much of the time, discourse analysis is seen as a rejection of realism in the social sciences. Realism is the idea that we can determine truth by reference to some kind of external world. There's something out there beyond us, beyond our society, beyond our experience, which is a reference point for truth. And insofar as things agree with what's out there, they are true, and if they do not, they are not true. Now that's realism, and that's been rejected pretty comprehensively by discourse theorists. For them, there's either side the question, is there anything beyond discourse? Well, for many, no, there isn't. There is only discourse. All we have is what people are saying and what they are meaning. Others, however, have come to see this as a bit too restrictive, and there's a new popularity now of what you might call the critical realist position, which accepts that to a large extent the social world we inhabit, the psychological experience we have of the world, those things are dominated by discursive approaches, and we can't say much about them beyond the fact that there are different ways of talking about the world. But the critical realist position wants to maintain that at least at some level there may be something else out there, but a non-social, a non-psychological world. And it rejects that radical relativism of discourse analysis that said there is nothing else at all out there. So the critical realists recognise that we are stuck within our discourses in any one particular period, but accepts that there may be other things out in the world, the materiality of the world, which may be in the longer term changing and undermining our discourses.